All right, we're going to kick off the next session here. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for the NFI Group presentation with us. From NFI, it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Soubry, President and CEO. It's good to see you, Paul. Good to see you back in the saddle at NFI.
Yeah, thanks.
As many of you know, NFI is the leader in transit buses in North America as well as in the UK. Obviously a leader in zero-emission buses, which is where the world is turning, and so obviously a great ESG story as well. This is a fireside chat, so for anyone that has any questions, please raise your hand and I'll get to you. But I've got a bunch of questions here for Paul and I, and so I think we'll kick it off. Again, Paul, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin.
Maybe I'll start with the elephant in the room, which is supply chain issues, chip supply chain issues specifically. Maybe give us an update in terms of where things sit today and how you're managing through this.
Sure. So context that most investors know of our business is it's a highly customized product. Every single bus is different, which makes the supply chain of small batches, whether you're building 2 buses, 5 buses, 10 or 100 per order, very difficult. Earlier in this year, our major supplier of modules, which is Parker Hannifin, a massive company, decommitted on the supply of these modules. Every bus has 5 to 8 of these modules. And so the module problem is it relates back to microprocessors that are inside this module. And there's 3 different types. One of the microprocessor suppliers decommitted to them. And the problem at that time is they couldn't give us a window of how long, how fast, how deep the problem would be. So we did 2 things. We slowed down the ramp up of our business. We continued to build buses down the line with slave modules. We went and took the bus offline, tested it as best we could, customer sign off as best we could, and we have the bus parked. After about a month or 2, we got a schedule from them, and the schedule really wasn't as great as we would like in terms of recovery. So we did 2 things. We created an alternate module. The problem is the alternate module is not a plug and play or a direct alternate. So now you got other issues with the bus that you got to change. And we started to go into the open market, and we started buying microprocessors 3, 4, 5 levels down in our supply chain that we've never bought before. So that's the ugly part of the story. The good part of the story is that recovery plan of delivering modules as planned started at the end of August, and they're now coming at the pace at which we need them. We're now in the stage where the swapping of modules is stopped. So with a bus that goes online today, the modules that are on it will come off the production line. But there's a couple hundred buses in parking lots waiting for modules. So the recovery is per schedule in terms of the supply side. What compounds it is the fact that other parts of the supply chain have not kept up as well. And so everything from individual components, anything to do with electronics or microprocessors are also late. We've had seat suppliers be late. Imagine in the middle of the production line, you don't have a seat to put on a bus, which means then you can't finish the stanchions and the doors and the windows and the frames and the air conditioning and so on and so forth. So the isolated problem of microprocessors that drive the modules is now behind us in terms of we're getting supply. And I think we now have enough modules in our hands now all the way till mid-2023. So I'm pretty excited about that. The rest of the part supply issue continues to be a challenge. I would suggest that the number of suppliers that we now have in critical, meaning they could shut our production line now, is dropped by a factor of half. So we're not out of supply chain hell, but it's better than it's ever been in the last month or last year or 2.
Okay. And then when you think of the, maybe the risk management processes you'll put in place here as you kind of look at the lessons learned, given all the supply chain issues, you're working through some of the more acute problems today, but longer term, what do you need to do to the supply chain to improve the resiliency?
So somebody that doesn't close to our business that would understand it, there's a few handcuffs that we've got on. First of all, the product that we build is based on a customer specification. So if the customer asks for a Thermo King air conditioner, I have to supply a Thermo King air conditioner. I can't put a Carrier air conditioner on or something. So some of that ability to alternate source just isn't there. If the customer says, fine, put a Carrier air conditioner on, then I got to rewire the bus. And so the cascading issues are very difficult. So wherever we can, we have tried to dual source. The second issue, we have historically, anybody that's been to our factory, we have a manual production line because every bus is different. So there's no automation, robotics, and so forth. We've gone away from warehouses. We have point of use inventory, and you've been there, Kevin, many times, but 6 or 7 days of inventory at point of use. So a week and a half of build, if you will. Because we don't have large continuous runs, because these batches are different, trying to go to 20 days of inventory point of use doesn't make any sense because it changes literally every week. Having said that, there are certain components that I can get readily. So I've moved my 6 or 7 days of inventory down to 5, and I can replenish it once a week. But there are certain parts that if I can get 12, 15 days of inventory point of use, I'm doing that on the production line. The third thing that we're trying to do is to try and push back to customers to be hard and fast that they can't make changes to their bill of materials inside a window before I line enter it. What happens traditionally is we bid on a contract, we're awarded the contract, we go through a negotiation phase to conclude the contract, then we go through a pre-production phase. And in that, inevitably, the customer says, you know what, I want you to turn the mirror upside down, I want you to change this, or whatever. So trying to freeze the bill of materials 20 weeks before we line enter it to finish the non-recurrent engineering in the supply chain is historically what we've tried to do. Through COVID and supply chain hell, that's not been possible. But trying to put hard and fast rules with our customers that guess what, if you try and change it within X weeks, there's going to be significant ad bills or surcharges. Those are the kind of things we're trying to de-risk the process.
Another pain point, it feels like, for the broader manufacturing sector has been labor availability, wage pressure. What are you seeing both in Canada and the U.S. and maybe in the UK as well? Sure. With the ADL operations?
So the U.S. has been probably our biggest pain point. We have facilities that are in many cases in rural communities, not major cities. Crookston, Minnesota, Pembina, North Dakota, St. Cloud, which is an hour and a bit out of the cities, Anniston, Alabama, outside of Louisville and Shepardville and so forth. And so the ability to retain through kind of wage escalation mania over the last little time has been difficult. The starting and stopping of our production through COVID is not a place some people want to, come to work today, don't come tomorrow, take this week off and so forth. So we've had turnover like everybody else has had. We negotiated our last major North American agreement in Crookston, Minnesota, St. Cloud, Minnesota this year. It was a 8% wage increase. We went back and reset most of our wages across North America up 4%. So our turnover has slowed down. The other part of our recovery as we get through this work in process is traditionally we run our production lines at about 90% labor efficiency, meaning 9 of every 10 hours that we pay an employee is sold into a bus. Through COVID and supply chain, that's dropped down to about 60%. So people would intuitively say, well, why don't you just reduce your workforce to today's dynamic? The problem then is if I get rid of these people, I'll never get them back. And they're not unskilled labor. You've been to the plant, they got to be able to read a blueprint, they got to be able to interrogate the system and so forth. So we've held on to an incredible amount of non-productive labor because our problem in our minds are relatively short windowed or bookended as opposed to we don't know where we're going to get our bus sales from in the future. We got massive demand and massive funding. So there's been that. So as we get back through the supply chain hell and we get back to normal buses online, we go from 60% to 9% productivity, not in one fell swoop, but I have not free, but already paid for labor capacity. The ability to hire in the U.S. is starting to slow down, as we know. And everybody says it, but being a beneficiary of a recession for us would be a very good thing, both on the supply side as well as labor availability. In Canada, we haven't had problems hiring people. We haven't really had turnover. We've adjusted our production schedules as best we can. As you know, we've rationalized some facilities. We're limited in what we can do in Canada because most of our work is U.S. origin and has to be Buy America compliant. But we are now working very aggressively at trying to think about how to expand the footprint in Canada, or our capacity, if you will, to build all electric. The UK is a bizarre dynamic. They're private operators that are performing a public service. They've had start and stop and hurry up and slow down. They live and die by the fare box. So ridership is now starting to recover across the world, the UK included. They have delayed the orders associated with their recovery. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the country is on strike. The rail guys are on strike, and we've had a strike action in one of our facilities last week. That has to play itself out over the next little while. But people are probably a secondary concern to us than the consistency and efficiency of supply chain delivery.
Okay. You obviously received some covenant relief a few months ago from your banking syndicate. It does look like you have sufficient liquidity here to work through some of these supply chain challenges, and it obviously a good sign that you're not swapping modules anymore. It's also a very fluid situation. So as you kind of sit here today and you think about the buffer that you have, what are other levers you can pull on to drive more liquidity through the system? You did start selling receivables. And then it's a question I often get, like how do you look at the dividend here, as a free cash flow priority?
So the exciting part of our syndicate, there's 11 banks, And that's the bad news. The good news is 11 banks, so the risk is spread across a number of people. When we did our covenant relief, which you could have negotiated in a month or two, I think wise counsel from our board was go dance with every one of those members of the syndicate so that they clearly understand the issues as opposed to the main guys dragging the rest of them along. So it took us 6 months to educate those people, which then ultimately helped us to get that covenant relief package. Every one of our banks looks at the future and says, wow, record level funding, record level bids in process, record level backlog. This is not about where I worry about I'm going to sell buses forward. I just got to get from here to there, which leads to this covenant package. I wish I could say by January 2nd, all my supply chain issues are going to be done. But the nature of our business, customized in batch quantities, makes it still a concern or a challenge. Liquidity is not our concern. There's math calculations in the covenants that's a concern. We have worked with our customers, and many have actually have advanced payments for us to help fund the work in process. So if you look at our bank line draw every day, we're not sucking cash from the bank. We're effectively treading water. We also have a couple of hundred buses, or more than a few hundred buses sitting in excess work process, waiting for whether it's a module or an individual part to finish. And one bus needs 5 hours to finish, and another bus needs 50, and maybe some of the crazy ones need 100. But that's as near cash as you can get. And we don't have bad debts because for any of a public customer to put a tender out, they actually have to already have it funded. So it's just a matter of timing. The combination of customer funding of some of this stuff that they've been very flexible. The combination of playing some of the receivable factoring game has been helpful. And quite honestly, we manage our payables as best we can to manage inside that environment. So my concern over the next year is not liquidity. It's more around the execution of the burn down of the WIP, the readiness of our factory to be not only reprocess it, but to continue to start to ramp up to meet our delivery demands.
You have maintained your 2025 EBITDA targets of 400 plus million of EBITDA. Obviously, this year your guidance reflects some of the challenges you just mentioned. Calling for 15 to 45 million of EBITDA. Can you just walk us through how we should think about that 3-year spread from essentially, let's say, low teens, mid-teen EBITDA to something that could be exponentially higher?
Yeah.
Like how can you ramp up? Are there?
Yeah, like 20 times higher. Yeah.
I wasn't great at math. But, how do we get there?
Look, we set those guidance targets at the start of COVID, and they were set for 2025 based on customer demand. We knew the funding was coming. I mean, we told you and the rest of the analysts for a period of time, trust us, but we know the U.S. funding is going to come. We know the Canadian government's going to come not only with federal funding to transit agencies, but also with funding, infrastructure funding relief. So it wasn't a demand problem we had. It was around execution. At the beginning of COVID, first of all, none of us knew how long and how many crazy waves, but we also had no clue of the impact on our supply chain. And quite frankly, a year and a half into COVID, supply chain wasn't our issue. It has become our issue. So the 2025 targets of north of 400 million EBITDA is not a dream or a miracle has to happen. It's an execution story. And so, yes, we have an order book that supports that kind of look. We have to continue to win at the rate that we are. Our zero emission win rate is higher than our conventional bus rate. So it all has to do to some extent with making sure we don't get, pardon the language, but screwed again with a firm price contract and a variable cost on the supply side. We didn't have variable costs. We had firm prices for most of our supply chain. The problem is they decommitted and they said, you want the window, you're going to pay twice as much. I'm kind of screwed because I have a firm contract. So going forward, we're now bidding contracts with the 15% hyperinflation I've already absorbed and an expectation of 5% more inflation next year. So buses I'm bidding today, or an electric bus for $1 million is 200 grand more than the bus that I bid 2 years ago. All those things play into that getting to the 2025, a $400 million, it's not a miracle. Timing may become an issue. We're in the process of revising our LRP. Customers, in many cases, that expect to buy X, Y, and Z zero-emission buses are also starting to realize, holy smokes, the infrastructure or the energy demand is not as simple as maybe the political masters said it would be. So, is there risk to it? Absolutely. Do I believe we'll get there? Absolutely. Could there be some timing changes? We'll let you know as we release our next year's guidance of how we've done it. But it's made up by customer, region by region, product by product. It's not just an expectation of order book.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously benefiting from a very strong, secular push to transition to electric vehicles. Have these supply chain issues, or how have these supply chain issues and maybe inflationary environment impacted the bidding process? Are transit agencies saying, I'd rather throttle back my bidding activity just to see how this plays out? As you mentioned, the 20% hike in a ZEB isn't an insignificant amount, or is there's just so much funding that it's available to them?
There's a couple issues. As we led up into COVID, so 18, 19, you'll remember the story of, geez, the order book's really down, the volumes are down, what's going on? And we kept saying, hey, that transit agency is trying 1 or 2 zero emissions, or maybe they're trying a fuel cell and an electric. They're trying to understand, what do they do with their fleet? Politicians at that time were saying, we're all putting dates on a calendar of, by such and such a time, I'll be zero emission. What's happened between now and then is that the money has actually been appropriated or been promised by the government. Transit agencies held off rejuvenating their fleets, then they went through COVID, which was hell, and now they're in a position where they're coming up to, if they don't start buying zero emissions now, they'll never meet their targeted dates of when they'll be zero emission. So I'm actually bullish, if you will, on the expected demand over that period of time. The other thing that relates to that is, because I haven't been able to deliver a bus to that transit agency, it's not like they've canceled my order. We've just adjusted the delivery timelines. And it's not like they can go over to my competitor and say, can you give me the bus any sooner? They got the same crazy issues that I've got in terms of supply chain. So we're all building a little bit of backlog, which then hopefully releases some of the crazy pressure of low pricing to fill slots. We saw some of that through COVID. We've seen less of it in the last little while through supply chain. But the transit agency is now hitting deadlines with money and political will. And the reality is we're headed to be the first industry to try and get to all zero emission, right? And so we should be. You know how many people are on that bus, you know where it goes, it's all publicly funded. It should be the poster child for zero emission and environmental benefit.
I again think back a few years ago, a lot of concern around the competitive dynamics in the industry, a lot of upstart electric bus manufacturers making big promises about what they could do. Where does that sit today? I mean, you mentioned you're the market leader, we see it in the data. Have these upstarts made any traction? Are transit agencies, do they trust these suppliers without a long history supplying buses to them in the past?
Well, maybe we'll use the North American transit bus as the case study, because we could talk about motor coaches or whatever. 2013, we bought NABI in the parts business of Orion. The industry rationalized down into 3 major players, us, Nova, and Gillig. Nova is publicly traded by Volvo and owned by Volvo. Gillig is privately held. Went through a bit of period of time through from 14 to 19 with really good, strong margins and performance and whatever. 19, we had that start of zero emission. You had the start of some of these, if you will, upstarts. You had BYD show up. BYD's first number of deliveries were not good, political shenanigans in California, bringing in Chinese goods and calling them American, all this kind of crap, all this kind of stuff. And sorry about that. and ultimately then the pressure between the United States and China, the FTA changes the rules. Any company that's state-owned, controlled, or subsidized can't sell and get access. So BYD's promises of becoming a major player has really gone off. They still sell buses in the United States, but they only sell them where they're privately funded or where they had a previous contract or state funded. So it's very, very small. So BYD is not a massive threat to us anymore. In fact, in the latest Toronto bids, BYD was disqualified and that kind of stuff. They didn't bid on the Montreal bids and so forth. Then there was Proterra. Now Proterra, we've all read and seen about, is this startup. Proterra's been around for 18 years. I think there's 900 buses on the road in 18 years. So I don't do math very well, but that's 50, 60, 70 buses a year. So it's not. Proterra builds a bus that is fiberglass. It's a monocoque structure. And of course, every bus is different. So you have to change the mold every time. This is not trivial. And it's not easily scalable. And oh, by the way, the molds have been cracking. So then we saw, not the molds, but the bus. Then we saw Proterra go through a SPAC. And of course, it goes from a $10 SPAC that's $40 and they're going to change the world and so forth. But when you read the SPAC materials, and even read now that they're a public company, the focus on bus is dramatically down. That's all around Proterra Propulsion and Proterra Energy. I don't see Proterra as a long-term major threat to my business. And when you look at where their bus has been in service, whether it's SEPTA or LA and some other places, they haven't gone well. Then there was this company called Arrival, which was going to change the world. It started off in the UK with trucks, and they were going to build trucks and buses, and they had this dream to create micro factories where they were going to do a bunch of programming, push print, and in this cell, this bus was going to be made. Well, guess what? It's not as easy as that. And when New York City or when a customer says, you didn't put on your proposal what I asked for, you're disqualified. So Arrival, that they're going to change our game, has not changed it in one bit. They have a contract for 2 buses in North America, and they're now going to, we believe, default on that contract. Okay. So I'm not worried about Arrival. Then there was pressure from Van Hool. Van Hool, a big Belgian company, was going to create a facility. There's no hole in the ground. There's no building. There's no North America. So I'm not saying I don't worry about competitors, but this massive disruption of our world and the promises of the SPACs that overnight zero emission is going to change the business. This is about recovering as an industry, us included. The future is very bright, but this is not trivial. You've been to our factory. Every single bus is different, which means the supply chain, the engineering. And while COVID and supply chain has killed us, we're bloody good at it. And when we get back to some semblance of normalcy in terms of the consistency of supply chain, we're in a pretty good spot. We just got to get from here to there.
Sounds like it. And any questions in the audience? Up front here.
When you look out to 2023, roughly what proportion of the buses you're going to deliver that year are going to reflect this new and improved pricing versus the old pricing where you're going to be squeezed by cost?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The vast majority of the pain we've suffered has been in 2022 builds. We have a few contracts that effectively bleed over into 2023 build that I bid previously. The quantum at this point in time, I'd say maybe ranging 15 to 20% of what we're going to build next year could be, or to 25 could be a problem margin. With all the pain we've absorbed from the supply chain, we're the unfortunate guy in the middle of the sandwich. Supply chain guy says, here's your new price, and oh, by the way, it's late. Customer says, I got a contract, you're going to absorb it. So we've gone out to every customer, and we've been asking the customers to share 50-50 in the hyperinflation pain, so roughly 7.5%. Vast majority of customers have responded, which is part of our recovery this year and next year. When we ask for those price concessions, where there is bleed into 2023, we're asking for it in 2023, and many of those negotiations are ongoing. Mm-hmm. So by the second half of 2023, we're in this new environment that I've added 20% to my price. I know I got at least 15% cost increase. The quotes we're getting from suppliers now seem to have slowed down in terms of more hyperinflation on top of it. I got a potential upside. At worst, I think I protected my downside.
So a question over there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And here is what we're going to do. Does the EV transition present that opportunity that you can cut down on the customization?
Variation.
It's hard to believe that a bus in New York is going to really has to be that.
The bus in TTC and the bus in Brampton are an apple and an orange. Here, it is ridiculous, but here's the reality. You and I you get elected as the mayor of a city, your city council, you got a 4-year window. You got a transit agency that has all this, and the city council's got all these pressure from all these special interest groups. The transit agency has a driver's union, a maintenance union, and some other unions that have opinions about what they want. The level of, the history of their fleet has this camera or that air conditioner or this telematics, and so there's an element of trying to get consistency with their fleet as opposed to consistency with the industry. I've been here 13 and a half years. We have never sold a reference bus, meaning a customer said, I need to move X people, Y distance in this weather with this topography, because the specifications reflect that unfortunate dynamic for the local. So I use this example all the time, and it's a little bit overtold, but I sat in a room with a customer and 19 special interest groups, and we talked about the poles, the stanchions on a bus, right? The first group to get up was the driver's union. They wanted them painted for depth perception. All right, that makes sense. The maintenance guys, no, they got to be stainless steel, we can clean them. The blind community got up and said they got to have ribs on them. Well, that makes sense. The next one was the senior citizens. They want them foamed. By the time you go through the group, that stanchion is not a stanchion anymore. So the local civic pressure and the politics and the special interest groups drive the local spec. And because in the United States, 80% is paid by the federal government, and the city only pays for 20% of the customization. So Arrival showed up and said, we're going to show you our bus. Do you like it? How many and what color? Hasn't sold a bus. It's not like a John Deere tractor or a Caterpillar that is configured before it goes on the line. And there's options that are pre-configured. These are truly customized. Will that ever change? Maybe. I haven't seen it yet. But that's the downside. The good side is we're really good at that multiple high-velocity, non-recurrent engineering and supply chain. Had COVID and then the crazy supply chain not happened, we wouldn't be in the position we're in short term. Long term, that customized nature serves and benefits me really well. Now the UK, which has a private operator base, First Transit and Go Ahead and all these other guys, that bid on a route and operate for public, they still customize their buses because they customize it based on what they think is the best way to ride their buses. Nobody sells a standardized bus. Will it change? I don't know. I go back to we're bloody good at it, and in good times we had great returns, ROS, ROIC. COVID, we're the poster child for hardest hit because of the variation.
Well, that's your tax dollars.
Great question.
Makes me feel good as a taxpayer.
Thanks for supporting, Kevin.
We all own 2% of a bus, apparently. Maybe last one here. A couple of minutes if there's any questions in the audience. Maybe just last one for me. You know, we have seen, broadly speaking, in the OEM space, this increased sensitivity to vertically integrate. You know, companies that had their battery supply were more vertically integrated during the pandemic seem to do a little bit of a better job delivering on their product. As you kind of work through this, is this something you think you need to do, especially on the battery side, which seems to be a greater focus, or on the chip side, let's say, which seems to be a greater focus?
So our strategy has been as follows. Common envelopes, same bus. You want a diesel, a natural gas, a hybrid, electric, a fuel cell, so that we get commonality around the structure as best we can. We have to respond to the question around high variability. I mean, we're responding with different thicknesses of floors. We have 27 different tints or thickness of windows. We have 105 different shades of white or gray. Like, this is mind-blowing. So to vertically integrate into stuff that's highly spec'd by the customers is a little bit risky or adds disproportionate cost. Can I do it cheaper than anybody else? Our strategy has been, we'll fabricate where we own the drawing. So where I make a bracket or a unique computer, or not computer, but electrical component, or the stanchions, we make our own stanchions, that kind of stuff. We've decided where it makes sense economically, we'll build it. So maybe 10, 12, 50% of our cost of sales is where I make the part. And I can do it faster, cheaper, in the little batches and so forth that I need. The heavy stuff like engines, transmissions, batteries, and so forth, that stuff is very expensive. It's experts in that field. The cost for me to get into a battery cell manufacturing or to buy capacity is crazy. What we've chosen to do is the packaging of all the battery. We call it juice box for fun, but it's an enclosure, and we control what goes inside there. We buy modules from battery guys. We buy heating and cooling and so forth, so the buses that are ambient temperature. We've worked with our battery suppliers where we used to have one, now we've got 2 and potentially 3 coming online. So I'm getting price pressure to bring the component down, but I need, just what I went through, I need multiple sources of supply on this stuff. And I don't want to put $100 million out to buy future capacity of batteries. If you're going to sell me the battery modules, you're going to put the money out. The other thing that's going to happen, and I'm not a technical guy, we've seen battery prices come down 80%, 100% in the last 5 years. They're going to continue to come down. I don't want to bet on the wrong horse. That's one issue. The second issue is that technology continues to change, right? And what is it, Moore's Law every year and blah, blah, blah. Well, now we're starting to talk about solid state battery technology. And now we're starting to talk about, this game is going to change at warp speed. The last thing I want to do is be pregnant, for lack of a better word, in an environment. So you got companies like Proterra that's done that, where they've invested $100 million secure battery supply. You know, good on them, but I think a multiple horse strategy is good for us. Lion Electric is planning and is investing and making this big factory. Are they a bus company or are they a battery guy? I think being a smart buyer with multiples is a better thing to serve us, given the rapid change and the variation of the customer demand.
Makes a ton of sense. Unfortunately, Paul, we've run out of time. It's great to see you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the NFI presentation. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you.